I've always been interested in maximum security prisons. In fact, it was the first film project I ever concocted as a very, very young kid. When I was 16, I wrote a story, and I was in touch with the maximum security prison in Bavaria, Straubing prison. Thanks God it never materialized. Recently I saw some of the correspondence I had with a warden, and I can only thank God on my knees that it never materialized, because it was fairly stupid. So, but it has always been an interest of mine, in particular now, death row inmates who, contrary to us, they know exactly how they will die, and they know exactly when they will die, but we do not. So that's one aspect, and of course another aspect is a general subject of capital punishment, and I'm not an advocate of capital punishment, obviously. Although I'm not an activist. It's not an activist film, but it's quite obvious where I'm standing. And fascination about crimes and the perpetrators, because my experience is that as terrifying the crimes are, and as monstrous the crimes are, the perpetrators are never monsters. I always see a human being, and I always respect them as a human being. So I'm never in the film, I'm always behind the camera, and yet I'm wearing a suit. I hardly ever wear a suit in my life, but as a sign of respect, I wear a suit. And I address them formally. I would not say, hey, Mikey, to Mikey Perry, how is it going? I say, Mr. Perry, or I would say, Mikey Perry, you will be executed in 8 days. How does time occur to you? So question of time is very interesting for me as well. How time comes to a standstill sometimes in their lives. And sometimes it races as if a whole day passes by in a second.
Like I'll forget, I'll literally forget. And then I'll look at my calendar, I'll hear someone say something, I'm like, man. And I'll sit back and I'll just stare at the wall and I'll be like, man, 8 days, 7 days, 6 days or whatever. And it's like, it's just, I must not be comprehending the fact that it's that close, because, you know, it's hard for me to say, you know what, like I talked about, you know, in 8 days, these people want to murder me.
So there are very different aspects to it, whole facets of, a bundle of facets of fascinations that are involved in this. And I must say it's the most intense project I've ever done. And Into the Abyss is the most intense film I've ever done, which, by the way, you can see with audiences. It was shown in Toronto in a big theater with 1,200 seats. And in a way, when I saw this huge audience, my heart for a moment sank. And I thought, how does a film like this come across? But the audience is sitting as if they wouldn't even breathe. They're completely focused in the film. So I have a good feeling that it's going to work with audiences. All the big nations on this planet are practicing death penalty. China, 1,400 million inhabitants. India, 1,300 million inhabitants. Pakistan, almost 300 million or 270 million. Indonesia, North Korea is a tiny country in terms of all the big nations. In Africa, the biggest, Egypt, Nigeria, Japan, they all are into death penalty. So I can continue the line of, so I'm not into American bashing nor in Texas bashing, and you should understand why. And I explain it to everyone, and I explain it to the inmates, and I explain it to the warden. I'm not an activist against capital punishment because I cannot vote in your country. I'm a guest in your country, and secondly, my historical background is a different one. And when I speak of historical background, I mean the barbarism under the Nazi regime, where you had an excessive amount of capital punishment. Parallel to that, you had a systematic program of euthanasia, where you would be killed as being worthless life if you were insane, for example. And on top of it, a genocide of 6 million people. End of story. I don't even have an argument, I only have a story. So I say, but of course I do not want to be didactic and tell the Americans you are doing it wrong. I say, with my different background, historical background, and being a guest in your country, I respectfully disagree with the practice of capital punishment. End of story. Into the Abyss is a film that will have its theatrical release. It's almost 2 hours long, or 1 hour 46 minutes long. And it is not just a crime and the perpetrators, in this case a complicated crime of 2 murderers, 3 murder victims, 4 crime scenes. But I was not only fascinated by that, I was fascinated by the repercussions a crime like that would have for the entire environment. I'm speaking to victims' families. I'm talking to the man who is a tie-down captain who would strap you down on a gurney, and who after 125 executions all of a sudden quits his job and can't do it anymore. Shaking uncontrollably, crying uncontrollably for hours and hours, and he knows I cannot do it anymore. Loses his pension over it and steps out of it. So it's much more than, it's a whole tapestry of a Gothic America, or something that's in a way like dark recesses of the human soul. He quit 11 years ago, but he tells me about 125 executions that he did and how he had to quit all of a sudden, although he was an advocate of capital punishment. And he was a captain of the tie-down team who did his job professionally and with integrity. And when you look at the man, you know immediately this man is has the most integrity you have ever seen in your life, and all of a sudden can't do it anymore. What happened? What happened? So it's a film that has ramifications far and wide beyond the crime itself. Death Row is only for television, and it's 52-minute films or 44-minute films, which in the United States would be a full hour, because I have commercials in between. And it is on single cases, on separate single cases of death row inmates. And it will be called Death Row and then Conversations with Joseph Garcia, or Death Row Conversations with James Barnes, or Death Row Conversations with Hank Skinner. So it's a television project, and it's as I call it, a mini-series, which eventually, let's assume that this has very, very intense reactions from audiences, I could continue and do 20 more films on Death Row. Into the Abyss, the main character in the film was executed 8 days later. And I'm completely, number one, I'm completely candid. I'm a straight shooter, and I tell him point blank right at the beginning the fact that life hasn't dished out a very bad deck of cards to you doesn't mean that this exonerates you, and it does not necessarily mean that I have to like you. And he's taken aback for a moment because he's never heard anything like this. But they love me for being so straight. How does it affect me? You see, during shooting I know I have 50 minutes 48 minutes in my conversation, somebody of the guards is having his hand on my shoulder, which means you have 120 seconds left. That's one side of it. The other side is you have to, you know you have 50 minutes, you have never seen the man before. Number one, you have to hit the right tone. You have to find the right tone right away. And second, you have, after all this, you have to deliver. You have to deliver a film. So it's, you have to do your job. It's functioning, making it technically all right. You have to know what the cameras are doing, 2 cameras. I'm behind the cameras. So it's performing and delivering. And there's not much thinking. But when I was editing Into the Abyss, it's so intense. It's very hard to describe. I can only give you one hint. Both the editor, Joe Beanie, and I started to smoke again. We had to step out in the under open sky, and we would hang on to a cigarette every hour, every 1.5 hours. And secondly, we are working 8 hours normally, very straight, very focused, very quick as we are working. But in this film we could only work 5 hours maximum and we would be spent. We were spent. The intensity of things and how it somehow affects you when you watch this and when you compare it to your own life. Our lives are always somehow subject with it. I would ask somebody who's going to die 8 days later, how should we live our lives? How should we cherish every moment? Finding, for example, in one case of the death row projects, how a prisoner on death row describes the ecstasies of a washing machine, that you can switch it on and nobody hinders you from it, and you can see how the vortex starts to spin, and you don't have, since 17 years he's washing his clothes in the sink, and he shows me how his little fingers are somehow full of callus and both of them crooked already from and the kind of ecstasy, the ecstasy and the magnificence of a washing machine. It's and things and it always actually immediately comes to, boils down to small family values. How to guide your children, how to be around for them, how to protect them, even though they have done something terribly bad. As a father, you stick to them no matter what. And all these things have not happened to them. And they're only like a step away from what we are. But they have taken the step into murder. And we have not.